Hello, everybody. Let's begin with the first chapter, which is the Introduction to Total Building Performance. At the end of this chapter, you'll be able to achieve these learning outcomes. You would be able to list the 6 performance mandates, which is a result of the 4 categories of the human needs. You'll be able to describe the concept of independency and performance priority of the 6 performance mandates. You'll be able to define the limit of acceptability of the various performance mandates. Now, let's look at what are the different performance mandates which define a good building design. There are 6 performance criteria or mandates: thermal performance, spatial performance, indoor air quality performance, acoustical performance, visual performance, and building integrity performance. Look at the space that you're seated in. Are you feeling too hot, too cold? Are you too sweaty? Okay. These factors are a result of the thermal performance of that particular space. Some buildings are aesthetically very pleasing, very comfortable, right? You're able to maneuver and navigate in a space very conveniently. That is because the spatial performance of that building is very efficient. Okay. Some buildings, you if you inhale air in those buildings, you fall sick. Somehow you tend to get cold and catch flu all the time, or your eyes are always itchy in a particular space. That's because of the indoor air quality is not good. So we will study the different factors which affect indoor air quality performance. Acoustical performance. This factor is important, or this criteria is important in especially in learning spaces, or say in hospitals, where we need the spaces to be very quiet, right? So acoustical performance of that particular space becomes important. Okay. The next performance criteria is visual performance. If in the learning spaces the lighting quality is not good, it affects your learning, right? If in a museum the lighting quality is not good, you would be able to appreciate the exhibits, right? So visual performance becomes a very important criteria which affects a good building design. Building integrity performance. If uh, the structural strength of the building is not good, in case of an earthquake, if the building is going to collapse, or if there are too many leakages, there are water leakages, air conditioning leakages, that affects the structural strength of that building, the building integrity, right? So these are the 6 performance criteria, the different factors which affect a good building design. You would look at thermal performance in a separate chapter. What we would study under this chapter is what are the different factors, what is the limit of acceptability of these factors. Okay, so the different factors, let's look at them: air temperature, radiant temperature, humidity, air speed, metabolic rate, and cloth insulation. All these factors affect the thermal performance of that given space. Now, what exactly is the difference between air temperature and radiant temperature? Right? Now, in any given space, we either feel too hot or too cold or just right. Now, what is the appropriate or the optimal temperature uh, for us, for the occupants to feel comfortable? This air temperature um, is very important in the thermal comfort. Now, what is the difference between air temperature and radiant temperature? The word radiant comes from radiation. Radiation we feel from the sun, right? We receive radiation from the sun. Now, let's let me give you this example. If somebody is seated by the window, say in library, right? The amount of heat received by the person by the window versus the amount of heat by the person seated towards the interior of that space. Okay. Now, the temperature, the air temperature in that library is the same, it's constant. However, the radiant temperature by the window is different versus the radiant temperature towards the interior of the space. Okay. Another example is, say a person is standing in the outdoor and it's not shaded versus a person who's standing in the shaded area, right? Now, the air temperature is the same, which is 32 degrees Celsius. However, the person who's standing in the shaded area experiences a different radiant temperature versus a person who's standing in the exposed area. So now that you understand the difference between air temperature and radiant temperature, let's move on to the next factor. The next factor is humidity. Humidity is a very important factor, especially in Singapore, because humidity in Singapore is very high. It's almost 90% in Singapore, right? So under the same air temperature given to two different countries, for example, Japan and Singapore, at an air temperature of 32 degrees Celsius, we feel much more comfortable in Japan, while in Singapore, we feel very sweaty. Now, that's because in Singapore, the humidity is nearing 90%, while in Japan, it's in the range of 60 to 70%, right? So humidity becomes a very important factor in the thermal comfort, and it affects the thermal performance of any given space, right? Airspeed. How stuffy we feel in a given space is affected by the airspeed in that particular space. There are regulations by the construction authority. For example, in Singapore, uh, BCA has a requirement for platinum buildings to achieve zero point 0.6 meter per second in naturally ventilated spaces, which is there is a requirement on how much airspeed is to be achieved in a given space, right? To ensure occupant comfort. So airspeed is a very important factor which affects the thermal performance of that space. Now, some of you feel very hot while some feel very cold in the same given space under the same controlled environment, which means the same temperature, the same airspeed, right? So why the difference? Why two different people feel differently? That's because the two different people have different metabolic rates. Our body construct is different, right? So metabolic rate is also an important factor which affects the thermal performance. People with high metabolism sweat a lot. They feel hot much more compared to a person with low metabolism. And that's why metabolic rate is also a factor which affects the thermal performance. Cloth insulation. If you're wearing thick layered clothing, you're going to feel much more hot, right? So with thin layered clothing, it's going to also affect the temperature that you experience. So that is why cloth insulation is also a factor which affects the thermal performance of that given space. Spatial performance. The functioning and the aesthetics of a given space falls under this category. Okay. Individual space layout. Now just look around you and look at the space that you are seated in, or where you are looking reading this lecture, right? Now, is the desk space given comfortable enough? Is your leg room enough? Is your seat located at a right distance? Do you have space to keep your elbows? All these considerations affect the individual space layout, and the individual space layout affects the overall spatial performance. Okay, now individuals, not just individual space layout, but also the spaces which are adjoining to the individual space layout, their design is also important, because these are the spaces which connect us to the other primary functions, right? For example, when your lecture is over, there is a common corridor, that's the spill out space, right? Now, is the common corridor width enough for all the students to spill out, right? Is it enough? Is it too is the length too much, right? Now this design affects the aggregate space layout. Conveniences and services. In any given space, look at the false ceiling. Behind the false ceiling is a network of ducting and wiring, right? Air conditioning ducting and electrical ducting, right? Now, if there aren't enough services provided, the function is not the space is not going to function efficiently, right? So that is why the conveniences and services provided affects and is important for the spatial performance of that given space. The amenities provided. For example, just outside the lecture theater, there are toilets provided. There is a canteen which is close to the LT or the learning spaces. So these amenities are important for the lecture theaters to function efficiently. So that is why the amenities becomes an important factor for the overall spatial performance. Occupancy factors and controls. Now, if in my office space I feel very hot or I feel very stuffy, I should be able to control the temperature of the air conditioning. This control affects the occupant comfort. If the lighting is very dim, I should be able to control, or you should be able to use my own desk lighting, my task lighting, right? This control affects the overall spatial performance. So we, under this criteria, under this performance mandate, we look at all these different factors. Indoor air quality performance. Indoor air quality is a very important performance mandate because it affects the human well-being. It affects the human health because we inhale the air, and it's very important that this air is devoid of any contaminants, right? So the thermal comfort, which is the temperature, humidity, also affects the indoor air quality. Okay, the chemical contaminants. Now, for example, the newly renovated spaces always smell of the fresh paint, right? Or the fresh finishes. Why is that so? Now, there are fumes which are emitted from these new finishes. They're called VOC, volatile organic compounds. These VOCs are not healthy for the human beings, right? And they're chemical contaminants. The proportion of these chemical contaminants affects the indoor air quality performance. Particulate matter. The quantity of dust particles which are so minute that they are suspended in air, and we breathe these particulate matters. Respirable particulate matters. These are prevalent during the haze conditions in Singapore, where we wear masks to protect ourselves from the haze or from the particulate matter from entering our lungs, right? Now, that is why particulate matter becomes an important factor which affects the indoor air quality performance. When we are sick, when we have a viral infection or flu, we do not come to school. We take MC and we rest at home. That's not just because we need to take rest, but also to avoid the infection to spread through the air, to avoid your classmates to get infected, right? So the chemical biological contaminants are also a very important factor which affects a good indoor air quality. Okay, so we would study these different factors under this chapter of indoor air quality performance. Acoustical performance. This performance mandate covers the sound source, the sound path, and the sound receiver. If these three different factors do not function efficiently, the acoustics of that space is affected, and we would not be able to hear, or we wouldn't be able to experience that space efficiently, right? For example, the lecture theaters acoustical performance of a learning space or a lecture theater is extremely important for effective learning, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to hear what your tutor or your lecturer is saying if the walls of your lecture theater are not um, finished well with good acoustic finishes, right? The sound would resonate or would echo if appropriate finishes are not used. That is why the design of any space which contributes to good acoustical performance is important. Visual performance. The lighting quantity and the lighting quality falls under this particular performance mandates. The different factors which contribute to the quantity of lighting would be lighting output, light levels, and brightness, right? For different tasks, there is different brightness which is required, right? Now, if it is not bright enough, the task would be affected, right? And that affects the visual performance of that space. For example, quality of lighting is also very important. For example, in a library, if I'm seated by the window, the amount of lighting provided in the library is optimal, is sufficient. However, there is light filtering in through the window of the library, which disturbs my eyesight, and I'm not able to focus and read properly, right? This is called glare. This too bright light which is filtering in through the window is called glare. Glare affects the visual performance of that library space. Okay. The other factors which affect the quality of lighting is uniformity. In any learning space, uniformity of lighting is extremely important. um, we cannot afford to have spotlights, which is one space is dark and the other bright in a lecture theater, right? Otherwise, the students would not be able to focus on the learning, right? Color appearance. Some spaces have warm lighting while some spaces have cool lighting, right? For example, restaurants have warm lighting, which uh, which where people are more relaxed. While in learning spaces or in hospitals where we need, which is more task oriented, there is cool lighting, okay, or white, or the light appears white, right? So the different appearance of or the different colors of this particular lighting condition is called color appearance. Color rendition. Um, we try a dress in a changing room in a mall, and we try the same dress in our house. It looks different. The colors of the dress look different. That's because of the different lighting conditions in these two different spaces affects the way the color appears. This is called the color rendition. Now, these different factors affects the overall visual performance of that space. The last performance mandate is building integrity performance. The mechanical properties, physical properties, and visible properties of any given space affects the building integrity, right? Now, what is mechanical properties? The structural strength of any building falls under this factor, under this criteria, right? Any air conditioning leakages or water leakages, this are basically the effect of failure of physical properties of that space, right? Buildings which are not aesthetically pleasing, or if there are physical damages, is of is a failure of the visible properties of that space. So the all these three different factors affect the building integrity performance. That brings us to an end of an introduction to the different performance